Blackwell Summit, please stand to your feet and give it up for my governor, our governor, Wes Moore.
Good morning. Good morning. Can we please give it up for our guy, Cedric? Man, this brother's amazing. And he's amazing because you are speaking and you are bringing not just truth, but you are bringing light. You are bringing light to all of our communities, and you are bringing understanding of what lifts up some will lift us up all. And that in this time and in this moment, if we're not talking about wealth, I don't know what it is that we're talking about. Thank you. Thank you for leading. Thank you for the friendship, and thank you for the example. And we are so grateful to have a chance to be here. And I know I'm also joined by some remarkable members of my team. Our spectacular Secretary of Labor, Secretary Wu, who I know is here. Our Secretary for Small, Minority, and Women Business Affairs, Secretary Martinez. And our Director of our Board of Public Works and just overall head taker, Manny Welsh, who is there as well. And so I have to tell you, when I first got the invitation to come here, this was going to be an easy yes. Easy yes. And both because, and I want to give a shout out to my dear friends and brothers in the work, Tom Geddes and Robbie Robinson, who anywhere they go, they ask, the answer is yes. When I got the invite from Robbie, I was like, absolutely, as long as I get a chance to hang out with you, I'm good. Yes. But this was an easy yes for me because also I know sometimes when these conferences happen and local mayors and local governors are like, well, you know, of course you come and thank you for choosing Maryland and thank you for spending money and all that kind of stuff. And I do hope you do that, like stay, spend money, don't get me wrong. But the reason that I was so passionate about this is one of the reasons that I ran for governor in the first place. Being able to address the issue of Black wealth, being able to address the issue of the racial wealth gap. I'm very clear that when we talk about that as a core priority for our administration, we mean that. When we say that is something we want our administration to be judged on, we mean that. Because if you think about the consequences that we continue to deal with, they're not just detrimental. These are things that are impeding our ability to be able to grow as a larger society. And I can tell you right now, I stand in front of this podium as maybe the most improbable governor in this country. You know, I'm the son of an immigrant, single mom who did not get her first job that gave her benefits until I was 14. And by the way, my mother, she got that job when I was 14 years old. First job that gave her benefits, first job that allowed her to work one job instead of multiple jobs, first job that gave her reliable hours. And let's be clear, this is a woman who went on to earn a master's degree. So when we're having conversations about inequitable pay between men and women or inequitable pay between people of color and non, this is not an academic exercise to me. I don't need a white paper to explain it. I've seen this. That I stand here as a governor who had handcuffs on my wrist when I was 11 years old. That I stand here as a governor who joined the Army when I was 17, as a person who went to a 2-year college. But the thing that I learned and I saw in all of our work, in everything that we have done, where people gave me an opportunity to learn about what was happening and to learn about my history, then I knew there was nothing about my future that wasn't possible. And that's the exact approach that we have taken, whether it was when I joined the military and led soldiers, or when I was in Baltimore City and I had a startup business that we had successful exit in 2017, or when I led one of the largest poverty finding organizations in this country, an organization called Robin Hood. And I remember when I was at Robin Hood, and this is a poverty fighting organization. And I said, we are going to start an initiative called 90 to 0. And it was all about addressing the racial wealth gap. And I had people there who were telling me, like, listen, we're a poverty fighting organization. Why are you focusing on the wealth gap? And I was like, well, if I have to explain it to you. But I was like, but if you'd like me to, I'll spend some time explaining to you why you cannot understand one if you do not understand the other. And you cannot understand one if you don't understand the intentionality of the other. Because those two are kissing cousins. And so when we had this conversation and bringing people on board, and we were bringing on the private sector, we were bringing on corporate partners, and then I said we have to involve the government in this work. We have to involve government agencies and government organizations to be able to address the racial wealth gap. And I had people who would tell me, like, listen, government moves too slow. Government is not going to solve this problem. And my answer to them was always this: why do you think the problem exists in the first place? Do you think that we have an 8-to-1 racial wealth gap in the state of Maryland because one group works 8 times harder? There's an intentionality to this. That you cannot understand the wealth gap if you do not understand things like the Homestead Act. That you cannot understand the wealth gap if you do not understand things like historic redlining. You cannot understand the wealth gap if you don't understand things like the GI Bill, which was helping out GIs as long as you looked a certain way. You cannot understand this if you do not understand the history of unfair appraisal values. Because unfair appraisal values has been responsible for some of the greatest wealth thefts that we have seen in our state's history. You cannot understand the racial wealth gap if you do not understand racist procurement policies. To say, why would you involve government in the conversation, means that there is a fundamental lack of understanding of why the conversation needs to be had in the first place. These policies are real. And these policies have consequences. And these policies oftentimes happen when we had people who were making the decisions that were either misguided, uninformed, or just flat malicious, and used their time in the seats to be able to increase disparities. Well, I want to be clear, that's not going to be me. And that's not going to be our team. Because inequality is a poverty choice, and it's a policy choice. Wage disparities is a policy choice. Low unemployment rates and low home ownership rates, that is a policy choice. And the thing that I was explaining to my friends at Robin was this: the only way that you can unearth bad policies is by starting to enact some good ones. Starting to be intentional. And when people say, well, that feels like it's a zero-sum game, my answer is this: no, the zero-sum game is keep on doing what we're doing now. That's the zero-sum game. And so I entered into this role, and I entered into government, and I knew I was new to politics. I'd never been involved in politics before. I don't come from a political family. You know, I always say I had to convince many of my cousins to vote for me. It's true. But it's not because I don't love my cousins. That's right. Not this one. But it's not because, you know, I don't love my cousins. It's because for some of my cousins, they never voted before. It wasn't something that was a natural occurrence. But we knew that in this time, that we were going to do things a little bit different. And we're going to enter with new policies that we're actually going to address and unearth and create opportunities for communities and for people who oftentimes have been neglected from that conversation. Policies that do more than just paint over cracks. Policies that actually fix a foundation. Policies that make sure that if we're talking about running a race, it is not okay if you have some people who are starting 200 yards in front of the other. How do we truly focus on a platform of equity. And that is why we have made tackling the racial wealth gap a core priority for the Moore-Miller administration. We've made work, wages, and wealth our North Star, because focusing on good jobs and well-paying jobs is fine. But if we are not talking about wealth, I don't know what we're talking about. When people say, so what exactly does that mean? What exactly does wealth mean? It means having the ability to own more than you owe. It simply means the ability to pass something off to your children besides debt. It simply means having the assurance that if something happens to you or if something happens to a family member and you have to deal with it, that is not going to be a decision that can end up having generational consequences. It means having an economy that is going to be vibrant, an economy that is going to be resilient, and an economy that is going to be equitable, and it matters to everybody because over the past 2 decades, the racial wealth gap has cost this country $16 trillion in GDP. And let's be clear, that's not GDP for a group. That's not saying GDP for this section or this neighborhood. That's GDP. So there are real economic consequences to this bigotry. And economic consequences that each and every one of us are facing. That this is about economic justice as it is as much about any other type of justice. And this is why we have to approach it with a type of intentionality and the type of diligence and, frankly, the type of cooperation that's going to be necessary. That in this moment and in this time, this is about how are we creating a state of ownership. Because when you build an ownership society, that's a society that everyone can benefit from. People who own things develop trust in a system that enables their participation. People who own things then have something they want to take care of. I remember I read a quote that Tom Friedman once said, no one washes a rented car. Right? If you own that car, you keep it clean. If you rent, you just give it back. But by creating a larger ownership society, we are giving people a stake in what they own. We are giving them a stake in their community and in their world. So how do we then turn around and build this ownership society? Well, first thing, we can start by reversing the bad policies that got us here in the first place. When people say, well, what are the things that you have to do and target in order to address the racial wealth gap? My answer is simple. What got us here? And start there. And so that's why in our first year, our core priority has been, and a major priority, has been addressing inequity in how government contracts are awarded. So for nearly every year for the past 10 years, Maryland has had an MBE goal of 29% participation. And again, a number based on looking at Maryland's population, fair accountable measures, 29% participation. During that time period, do you know what Maryland has never hit? 29%. And by the way, with no consequence. Because we have this free waiver process and we allow things like, well, we gave it our best shot to be enough for free waiver processes. And I always say to myself, that's like giving my kids a bedtime at 9 o'clock. And at 10:30, they're still up. I'm like, what y'all still doing up? Well, we thought it was a suggestion. You cannot have a goal that you have no intention of hitting. And in our time, and in this state, we set goals that we plan on hitting. And that's why if you look in just our first months, just in our first month as governor, that our team has worked to implement new safeguards and accountability measures to make sure that in the state of Maryland, we are going to hit our MBE goals. That in our first months to date, we have advanced over $500 million in procurement awards to minority and women-owned businesses, and we are just getting started here in this administration. That we've also approved, signed, and introduced the Access to Banking Act for small businesses so our entrepreneurs of color can get the liquidity that they need to turn an idea into a burgeoning business that is going to benefit everyone in our state. That we are working in partnership to create an education system that is teaching our students how not just to be employees, but how to be employers. That we've introduced legislation that's focusing and supporting veterans of color, where veterans of color are now receiving tax relief that's been codified into law, and we got that done in our first 100 days. That we've worked with the General Assembly to address the appraisal gap and historical redlining, and to ensure that the communities that have been most impacted by historical redlining are the first ones that we are going to address and support as we dig ourselves out of that hole. And we are working with members of the General Assembly to focus on how do we turn renters into owners. How do we focus on home ownership? How do we create an ownership society? How are we providing opportunities for individuals to be able to support businesses that they know are going to have a long-term higher return on that community? How are we making sure that people have the opportunity to purchase and to get on assets that will grow in value and can be passed on? As we're approaching this new year, we have let folks know that we take this seriously, and that we're just getting started. And I want for the state of Maryland to be the leader in this. I want for part of our legacy to say that we're the ones that got this right. I want for part of our legacy to be that we were able to see everybody, and that we understood the urgency of the moment, that we understood the urgency of the time. And while I am proud of the fact that the people of this state elected me as their 63rd governor and the first black governor in the history of the state of Maryland, I'm also very clear on something else. Making history wasn't the assignment. That's not the goal, and it never was. This work is personal. When I think about my grandfather was the first one on my mom's side of the family that was actually born inside this country, born down in South Carolina. And when he was just a toddler, my great-grandfather was a minister, and he's a very vocal minister. You know, he was one of these ministers, and that's why I love the fact that y'all are City of Praise, because I know we got a minister like that here. And it's good to be back. But he was a minister who believed that his job wasn't just to teach the Word of God. His job was to remind people on this earth now to act accordingly. And that didn't always make my great-grandfather popular. And when my grandfather was just a toddler, it was the Ku Klux Klan that ran my family out. And not out of the neighborhood, out of the country. And my great-grandfather in the middle of the night picked up his family to include his young son, my grandfather, and they moved back to Jamaica. And for much of my family, they always pledged to not come back to this country. But my grandfather did. And my grandfather, and I always say in all humility, my grandfather, would always say, this country would be incomplete without me. And he was right. And so he came back, he went to HBCU, he became, yes. And he ended up becoming a minister, like his father, and he became the first black minister in the history of the Dutch Reformed Church. This was a person who had a deep Jamaican accent his entire life and was maybe the most patriotic American I've ever met. He loved this country. He believed in this country. He was willing to sacrifice for this country. And when he passed away when he was 87 years old. He had his homecoming. I was actually in Afghanistan. I was serving with the 82nd Airborne when he had his homecoming. And when he passed away, he left a remarkable legacy. He left a remarkable contribution. But he also had nothing to pass off to his children. This was a man who lived his entire life with dignity. This is a man who lived his entire life with courage. This is a man who sacrificed every single day for faith, for family, for neighbors. And if there's anyone who earned a right to be able to pass something off to his children, it was him. It's not because he didn't work hard enough. It's not because he didn't sacrifice enough. It's not because he didn't dig deep enough. It's because he chose to serve a society that was not built to serve him. We've got to do better. We've got to make sure that we are building an ownership society where everyone is seen. We've got to make sure that we are building an ownership society where everyone can endure. We've got to make sure that we're building an ownership society where what we have to pass on is not just good works and not just strong legacies, but that we're able to pass something off to our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren and our great-great-grandchildren that shows that we too sing America and that we too own America. This is the time for us to get this right. That's the assignment. That's the task. That's the goal. I want Maryland to be the epicenter. I want Maryland to be the best place in the world to change the world. I want Maryland to lead. I want this to be Maryland's decade. I want us to solve this problem. And man, when Maryland does it, I want to let every other state know you have no excuse but to follow our lead. We have the roadmap. We have the template. We've been able to address the issues. And now in this moment, in this time, it is up to all of us to make sure that we are addressing these wounds from the past. We inherited it, but we will fix it. And when we do, we are going to build a society that for those who fought and came before us, that they hope for. And those who come after us, that they deserve. Thank you for leading. Thank you for pushing. Thank you for partnering. And thank you for not taking no for an answer. God bless you guys, and thank you for all that.